Welcome everyone. Um, Thank you all for your interest in spending the next 90 minutes with us on this beautiful spring day or winter evening, as I heard from Berlin, depending on where you are. It's quite an international gathering. Yeah, we have also people joining from Valencia, Spain, and from Swansea, Wales. And Berlin. Um, that's it's great to see you all. My name is Deniz Göktürk. I'm a professor in the Department of German at UC Berkeley, and this is the second installment of our series of workshop conversations with writers. Archives of Migration, the Power of Fiction in Times of Fake News. The series gives us an opportunity to experience contemporary literature in action at this time of social isolation, and to think with writers about questions of truth and fiction. And we were off to a lively start on March 5th with Sharon Dodua-Otu here. And today it gives me great pleasure to welcome another guest from Berlin, Zafer Şenocak. Willkommen, hoş geldin, Zafer.
Hi.
The series was conceived jointly with my colleague from the Department of German at UC Davis, Elisabeth Grimmer. Elizabeth, along with Jonas Teupert, will be moderating the final event in the series this semester with Yoko Tawada on April 16th, which will feature a reading from Tawada's book, Paul Celan und der chinesische Engel, available in a Kindle edition. And we are planning to continue the series in fall, engaging in conversations with contemporary writers who draw on multilingual archives and bring diverse perspectives to questions of societal polarization and the power of poetic imagination. So we've all been confined to our homes and hooked to screens for over a year now. Writers have been deprived of revenue from reading tours and public events. Lockdown isolation notwithstanding, the pandemic has also been a time to read, reread, and reconnect. On a positive note, we have been learning to Zoom and engage in long distance collaborations such as today's with greater ease and regionally and across continents. And so as nation states around the globe have been reinforcing their borders, we have designed this series of literary conversations with a focus on border crossing stories that are not contained in national history books, asking how writers and readers of fiction intervene in identitarian ideologies, which have been on vogue both in nation state policies and populist movements. So the question here is, can poetry and fiction in its creative engagement with personal archives yield resistance to totalizing worldviews? Our series aims to complement the historian's use of archives by asking how writers activate, animate, and reimagine historical source materials. So before we really kick off, thanks are due to all the people who have made this series possible. The German consulate in San Francisco, who contacted us last year offering help, which resulted in generous support for these conversations with transnational writers. In particular, Elena Zims, I would like to thank her for her enthusiasm for this project, and also Consul General Hans-Ulrich Südbeck for offering words of welcome at the opening event. We are also grateful to the Institute for European Studies and the German Historical Institute Pacific Regional Office for co-sponsorship in line with their research focus on migration. And particularly our Zoom mother, Heike Friedman, for helping with publicity and organization. Karfreitag is a holiday in Germany and at German institutions. So we are particularly appreciative that you are working to support us on this day. A warm welcome goes to our colleagues at UC Davis and all the other universities you're joining us from. It is wonderful to see comrades, fellow translators, and longtime interlocutors in the audience. So welcome everyone. And the audience has already discovered that you have opportunity to participate by sharing comments and questions via chat throughout this event. We will do our best to keep an eye on the chat and channel your questions in the course of the conversation. So let me briefly introduce Zafer Şenocak now. He is well known to everyone here, I suppose, but let me just say a few words by means of introduction. So Zafer Şenocak, born in Ankara, Turkey, raised primarily in Munich, as he likes to emphasize, and based in Berlin, has been publishing poems and prose in German since 1979. And he has held appointments as a writer in residence at various universities in France, Canada, and the US. His works have been translated into many languages. A selection of his essays was published in English translation by Leslie Adelson as Atlas of a Tropical Germany in 2000. So Fragmentary Histories and Unreadable Archives, the title of today's event, are recurring themes throughout his writings. His novel Gefährliche Verwandtschaft, published in 1998, was translated into English by Tom Cheesman, who is also with us today, as Perilous Kinship, 2009, available in an electronic edition from Hafen Books and on Amazon. So both Leslie and Tom have published seminal analyses on Zafer's work. Hello to both. So from 2001 onwards, Zafer turned more to Turkish and published 4 novels in Turkish. Alman Terbiyesi, translated by Helga Dağyeli-Bohne as Deutsche Schule, but also Yolculuk Nereye, Köşk, and I've got my whole Zafer library lined up here. Dünyanın iki ucu. And then with the book about his father in Deinen, Worten, Mutmaßungen über den Glauben meines Vaters, in your words, conjectures on my father's belief, is a book about, he returns to German, and it is really a book about a different kind of Islam, distinct from the one propagated by the current regime in Turkey, an Islam that feeds on mystical traditions, poetry, and humanism. And this book is currently, I hear, being translated into Turkish. Zafer has also continued to publish volumes of poetry, both in German and Turkish. Recent volumes are Der Gedanke des Freundes and Kıyı ve Kabuklar. Şenocak is known and also as a regular commentator on culture and politics in newspapers, Die Welt, Die Tageszeitung, der Tagesspiegel, also lately on Deutschlandfunk Kultur. A recent essay is provocatively titled Die Rückkehr des Stammesdenkens, the return of tribalism. Zafer and I have been in conversation since 1990, I think, or was it 89, in Berlin. We co-edited an anthology of Turkish literature back then, and we were on a joint mission to correct common misconceptions about Turkish culture. And he's also no stranger to California, having held writer-in-residence positions at various North American colleges. He came to Berkeley with a visiting appointment funded by the Max Kade Foundation back in 2003. And we co-taught a seminar at that time on hybrid cultures, Jews and Turks in Germany. This was actually an updated version of a course that I had previously developed with my mentor, Rodney Livingston, at the University of Southampton in the UK. I think he's also in the audience today. In 2008, Zafer visited again and participated in a panel with Homi Baba and Yoko Tawada. In 2016, some of us gathered with him for a conference at the Abi Warburg House in Hamburg. The volume growing out of this conference, I just heard Wortbrüche, Fragmente einer Sprache des Vertrauens, edited by Ortrud Gutjahr, will finally be published by Transcript this spring. So back to today's gathering, we decided to focus on recent work and work in progress for today's reading. Students in my seminar on modern German literature, archival resistance, this semester, Freya Zhang, Elizabeth Sun, Ardo Ali, Oliver Arthur, and Giselle Lee, all scattered around the globe, helped to prepare for this event. They did read Gefährliche Verwandtschaft, and we agreed that ironic ventriloquism, is perhaps the most compelling feature of Zafer Şenojak's fiction. And we jointly translated an excerpt from Zafer's forthcoming book, Eurasia. He will say a little more about that in a bit. And this excerpt will be read by one of the students, Freya Zhu, later on. And last but not least, also joining us today is Kristin Dickinson. It is a great pleasure to welcome Kristin back, who holds a PhD from Berkeley, is now an assistant professor of German studies at the University of Michigan. Her PhD was actually in comparative literature. Her research on the intersections of German and Turkish, or rather Ottoman Turkish literature, examines the potential of translation as both a formal and a social medium to intervene in nationalist ideologies and nationally structured areas of study. She's a recipient of the Charles Bernheimer Prize from the American Comparative Literature Association. And the most important news is that her book, Disorientations, German-Turkish Cultural Contact in Translation, 1811 to 1946, is almost out. It will be published on May 31st. Congratulations, Kristin. It examines literary translation as a complex mode of cultural, political, and linguistic orientation. And herself fluent in Turkish, Kristin has been working on Zafer's poetry, also Turkish poetry lately. So she is the perfect interlocutor for this conversation. She has herself translated prose and poetry by Zafer, as we will also see later. and she will help with framing the conversation today. So before I hand it over to Kristin and Zafer, I should mention that we will be switching between languages, English, German, and at points Turkish today. At some point we were going to do this whole event in German, but then as it evolved, we decided everyone should speak what they feel like. And so all three languages are welcome, and you can chat your comments multilingually. Zafer will be reading some brief passages from his recent book, Das Fremde, das in jedem wohnt, as well as his novel in progress, Eurasia. So, what you'll be experiencing will be a sneak preview of the work in progress. And let me just stress that in the light of current controversies on societal polarization, this conversation with a writer who has been engaged in debates on cultural memory, identity, and diversity for several decades now seems particularly timely and exciting. And this recent book, which I recommend warmly to everyone, Das Fremde, das in jedem wohnt, Wie Unterschiede unsere Gesellschaft zusammenhalten. The foreign dwells in everyone, differences hold our society together. Was published in 2018 by Edition Körber in Hamburg, and presents a spirited intervention in these debates and a plea against any and all simplistic categories of identification and totalizing grand narratives of the West versus the East. So this project resonates not only with German studies, but also with the new initiative in Turkish and Ottoman studies that we are currently launching at Berkeley. So we will start with a passage from Das Fremde, das in jedem wohnt, on hearing church bells in Istanbul, passend zum Karfreitag. Zafer, the screen is yours. Der Bildschirm gehört dir. Erzähl uns ein wenig von den Unterschieden, die die Gesellschaft zusammenhalten.
Yeah, first of all, before I switch to German, reading out of my book, I want to say thank you for organizing this event, and hello to everyone. This book was not planned, in fact. It was a kind of side work. I was writing on different type of books in the last 5 years, mostly novels, but also a collection of poetry. And when the publisher came with the idea, I should somehow sum up my work, which was, we started in the beginning of the 90s with essays about the issues we are discussing today a lot. Memory, identity, broken identities, question of standpoints coming from cultural heritage, war of cultural heritage between different backgrounds. I was a little bit resistant, and I was thinking, this is not necessary. But when I started to write the book, I understood that this is a very personal issue. I should write a book about my personal experiences all the way long, from the first memories back to my childhood until today's composing different identities together, heritage together in Middle Europe and also in Turkey. So it's a book which is a kind of travel book. It's not a memoir. It's not really autobiographic, but it uses autobiography as a literary form. I want to read one short passage, Kirchenglocken in Istanbul. Wenn ich in Istanbul bin, wohne ich in einem Viertel, das früher mehrheitlich von Armeniern und Griechen bewohnt wurde. Istanbul trägt hier noch die Spuren einer Stadt, die verschiedenen Völkern und ihren Kulturen Heimat bot. Byzanz, Konstantinopel, Ostrom. Namen einer Stadt, die etliche Wendepunkte erlebte. An vielen zentralen Plätzen dieses Viertels stehen keine Moscheen, sondern Kirchen. Wie kann es sein, dass eine Stadt, ein Land, eine Gemeinschaft über Jahrhunderte multireligiös ist und dann fast über Nacht durch Vertreibung und mörderische Verfolgung in die Hand einer einzigen Glaubensidentität fällt? Dass genau dieses im vergangenen Jahrhundert nicht nur in Istanbul geschehen ist, das wissen wir. Doch was macht dieses Geschehen mit jenen, die übrig bleiben? Täglich hört man Kirchenglocken in Istanbul, auch heute noch. Sie sind nicht verstummt, sie sind leise. Man muss genau hinhören, um sie im tosenden Lärm der Metropole wahrzunehmen. Man hört sie, wenn man sie hören will. Mir kommt das Kirchengeläut ein wenig so vor wie die alten arabischen Schriftzeichen. Die sind in Istanbul auch überall präsent. Neuerdings wegen der Geflüchteten aus dem Nahen Osten, aber auch als Relikte aus osmanischer Zeit stehen sie auf alten Gebäuden, an versiegten Brunnen, auf Grabsteinen. Diese geschwungenen, malerischen arabischen Buchstaben. Niemand nimmt sie wahr. Diese Nichtbeachtung entspricht dem Schicksal der Kirchenglocken. Es sind Klänge, die ich in Deutschland ignorieren würde. Nicht nur, weil sie so leise erklingen. Etwas Seltsames passiert. Im muslimisch dominierten Istanbul mit seinen dröhnenden Gebetsrufen, seinem überlauten Stadtverkehr, den vielen nicht identifizierbaren Geräuschen werden Kirchenglocken zu einer Heimat für mein Ohr. Etwas Vertrautes, das mein Inneres füllt. Ein sehendes Hören beginnt. Vor meinem Auge tauchen die Kirchen Oberbayerns auf, die in Dörfern mächtiger erscheinen, als sie sind. Ich fahre mit meinem Auge eine Landschaft ab, die sich in meiner Vorstellung niedergelassen hat. Kaum jemand außer mir nimmt hier die Kirchenglocken wahr. Den Muezzin kann man nicht ignorieren. Er hat sich an den Lärmpegel der Stadt angepasst. Der Muezzin ist laut, lauter, als mir lieb ist. Seine Stimme schallt aus Lautsprechern, die nicht nur aufgedreht sind. Oft verzerren sie auch die menschliche Stimme und machen Sprache und Mund zu Fremden. Der Muezzin hat kein Ohr mehr für seinen Gesang. Er ist mit seinem Lautverstärker eins. Die Kirchenglocken dagegen haben keinen Körper. Sie kommen leicht, schwingend daher und lassen sich in meinem Ohr nieder. Sie werden zur bleibenden Erinnerung.
Thank you so much for reading this passage. This little piece may seem like an unlikely place to begin a conversation on archives, but your reflections on the church bells in Istanbul really resonated with me for several reasons. And one of them is that most, if not all, of the unreadable archives in your literary texts, for example, the notebooks at the center of Gefährliche Verwandtschaft, or Salih Bey's memoirs in Alman Terbiyesi, or the library of the last ruling Ottoman Caliph in Köşk, are unreadable from the standpoint of the present, precisely because they are written in the Perso-Arabic script, and precisely because of the history of modernization in modern Turkey that has rendered them illegible. And given this, and given the presence of this kind of reflection on the Arabic, the Perso-Arabic script in your writing, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit for us on this connection that you draw, your association of the church bells with the Arabic script in this piece.
Ja, ich springe jetzt ins Deutsche. Also im Grunde genommen geht es in diesem Buch ja immer wieder um Widersprüche. Und wie entstehen Widersprüche eigentlich? Sie entstehen einmal in der Erinnerung, dass man sich an etwas widersprüchlich erinnert. Sie können aber auch außerhalb der Erinnerung in einer Reflexion entstehen, indem man sozusagen die Erinnerung für sich sprechen lässt. Und das ist im Grunde genommen die Erfahrung des 20. Jahrhunderts, dass wir ständig diese Widersprüche in uns selber von Ort zu Ort mitnehmen. Und das nennen wir dann oft Migration, aber im Grunde genommen bleiben wir an einem Punkt haften, der nicht mehr erzählt wird. Und mich interessieren diese Punkte, die nicht mehr erzählt werden, die zurückbleiben. Und die Kirchenglocken gehören zu diesen Punkten und die arabische Schrift gehört zu diesen Punkten, die nicht mehr erzählt werden, obwohl sie existent sind. In jedem einzelnen Menschen, in jeder Beschreibung anders. Deswegen taugen sie auch nicht für ein Nationalarchiv, sondern sie taugen vielleicht für ein persönliches Archiv, wenn man dieses Archiv nicht verdrängt, wenn man dieses Archiv aufnimmt. Und das sehe ich auch zentral für die Arbeitsweise des Schriftstellers, wie ich ihn mir schon vor 30, 35 Jahren zu Beginn meiner Prosaarbeit konzipiert habe. Im Grunde genommen schreibe ich seit dieser Zeit, seit Anfang der 90er Jahre, mein erstes Buch, Der Mann im Unterhemd, war eine Sammlung von Geschichten, in der schon eigentlich alle Themen angelegt sind, die später gekommen sind, schreibe ich eigentlich an einem größeren, längeren Buch, an dem immer wieder diese Erinnerungsversatzstücke auftauchen, die natürlich mit mir zusammenhängen, aber die nicht autobiografisch sind im Sinne, dass ich etwas erzähle, was mir passiert ist, sondern es ist, ich glaube, es war Max Frisch oder Peter Weiß, einer von den beiden Autoren, die hat von der autobiografischen Fiktion gesprochen. Es ist im Grunde genommen eine Annäherung an die eigene Geschichte, indem man sozusagen aus der Haut fährt und von draußen auf sich selber schaut. Und so auf diese Weise versuche ich eigentlich, meine Texte zu konstruieren. Und die Figuren, die auftauchen, oft Familienmitglieder, Mutter, Vater und Freunde, Verwandte, Nachbarn, werden sozusagen zu einer Population, einer Art werden neu belebt, indem sozusagen die Geschichte mit diesen Figuren weitererzählt wird. Und so ist natürlich auch fast jeder Roman aufgebaut, wenn man sagen will, es ist ja nichts Originelles, dass solche Figuren aufgebaut werden, die irgendwie aus einem Hinterland kommen. Ja? Der Unterschied ist in diesem Buch, dass die Erzählung immer wieder unterbrochen wird mit Betrachtungen, mit Fragestellungen. Und diese Melange oder diese, wenn man will, hybride Form ist etwas, was mich eigentlich schon von Anfang an beim Schreiben von Prosa sehr interessiert hat. Und ich habe das in der Gefährlichen Verwandtschaft auch angewandt in dem Roman. Im letzten Roman, an dem ich jetzt arbeite, ist es ein bisschen mehr in den Hintergrund getreten, weil da die erzählte Geschichte im Vordergrund steht. Aber eigentlich klingt es auch wieder mit hinein. Und es ist ein Versuch, die Großerzählung von Identität und von großen Reisen in kleine Partikelchen zu trennen, herunterzubrechen, wenn man so will, um sie wieder zugänglich zu machen für unsere Ohren. Weil ich habe das Gefühl, dass unsere Ohren unglaublich verstopft werden durch riesige Geschichten, die eigentlich kein Mensch mehr wahrnehmen kann. Und wo jeder meint, eine Meinung zu haben. Aber der Schriftsteller, der eine Meinung hat, hat eigentlich schon verloren aus meiner Sicht.
Your last remarks are really interesting, and they also recall for me the importance of Klang and Stimme as a recurring theme in your text, particularly in relation to the sound of Arabic and the sound of Ottoman Turkish, which you often talk about as having heard your father speak, sort of the kind of Turkish that your father spoke. is there a way that also the question of sound ties into these contradictory elements that you wish to emphasize through the bringing together of the church, the sound of the church bells and Arabic, even though the examples of the Arabic script that you give are written in that particular essay?
Well, I have here to talk a little bit about my background, maybe, because my background coming from a family where my father represented a more traditional way of Turkish culture, a kind of religious revival of faults, which started very much in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and he was always part of it somehow. And my mother, coming from a secular family, brought me to a kind of interesting frame, in fact, in which this different types of persons in both families were together somehow in this Turkish identity, but it was not one identity somehow. It was very different socially from the mood. And my mother was much more a rational person. My father was more this mystical guy, in fact. He was interested in my poetry. My mother was absolutely not interested in my poetry. He was very sad that I am not a physician or I don't work on a technical field or things like that. And my father was always from early times supporting me in writing poetry. And so he was a very untypical Muslim. If you look to Muslim figures today, who are not very kind to arts or to more sophisticated forms of thinking, I have a lot of experiences in this direction, so I can say it so directly, even it sounds not very polite. But I would say this type of difference in the family brought me to writing. It was not the migration. Everyone is thinking, oh my God, this guy came as a child from Ankara, Istanbul to Munich, Bavaria, and this is an interesting new experience. And when he writes in German or he writes in Turkish, and what is the bilingualism and all those things? Well, this is part of my life, but the real key issue, which is in all books, and this is what you also mentioned with the sound and with the meaning, sound and meaning, or the locations, the different locations, the different symbols of which leads you to think about where you come from. And this can be very subversive because no one expects it. People have expectations. Everyone, reader has expectations. I have also expectations. We communicate over expectations. And my way of writing is to ask, to question these expectations. And it was for me very easy because I had this background where all the time expectations were somehow hurted or reconstructed and changed and surprisingly bringing me to different points. And I started to reflect over identity from this point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The question of unexpectedness, sort of where you arrive from a given standpoint, I think brings us back a little bit to the questions of unreadability and unreadable archives. And I wonder if you could also reflect on the way in which unreadable archives across all of your writing and your essays and your novels, and perhaps also in your poetry, are never a stopping point. They present in some way as untranslatable, but they are never really untranslatable. They actually are multilingual. They're sometimes citational. They're sometimes they involve transliteration. And in that way, they demand a different kind of translation, a kind of unexpected or surprising translation. And they serve in the way that they sort of exist at the edges of the unreadable, they serve as a prompt for your main characters to actually engage in poetic practice. And I wonder if the church bells serve in a similar way for you to sort of engage with the city in a different way. There are different points in the book, Das Fremde, deinen, jedem, wohnt, where you talk about, well, I made this decision in 2018 to go to Istanbul, and my friends are like, why are you going to Turkey now? Why at this moment? What are you going to do there?
Yes,
and it's interesting to me to see the way that you sort of engage with different neighborhoods in this book, and the way that the city serves as a kind of a different kind of source of reflection than the very specific biographical elements which are sort of woven throughout that collection.
Well, look, the interesting question for me is indeed what's hidden in this unreadable archives.
Mm-hmm.
And all books I wrote until now, and I think I will write until the end of my life, are about this question. What's hidden and what's hidden? What's hiding there? And of course, if you are Turkish origin, as a Turkish national in the beginning, born in this country, and then you came to Germany, you have a very, very interesting composition, in fact, in your identity card. I mean, you are two very hurted countries coming together there. Seldom people speak about it, interestingly. The Turkish-German encounter is a very heavily encounter of traumatic experiences. For example, Turkish families seldom talk about their backgrounds. We have so many, my own family, we have so many backgrounds in our family, but I never listened to my relatives talking about this. Coming, for example, as a refugee family from Georgia, what is Georgia today, from Batumi. What was it? What kind of travel was it? What kind of bad experience was it? What kind of trauma was this to leave the home? They left their home in the end of 19th century. So they are not from Istanbul or from Ankara. Everyone is from Istanbul when it comes from Turkey. Everyone is from Ankara. This is absolutely nonsense. People are coming from very, very different backgrounds and they don't talk about it. So you already had a absolutely hidden private archive in yourself. You don't need to go to the library. It's absolutely uninteresting because the insight of the people is really 100 times more interesting than all the archives you can read that you can discover. And this is, but it is very. I think it's painful. Maybe it's painful, or it's somehow irrationally or ideologically erased. So what is the task for the writer? What is the task for the novelist? He has to look into the dark hole. And when he starts to search for words. It's what is called in German, dem Schweigen abbringen. How we can translate it into English, dem Schweigen abbringen. Schweigen is not silence, in fact, it's to be mute. To bring something which is mute to move and to start to speak. And this is, I think, the literary form, how I try to write my books, or the background. And so many stories come together. The church bell comes together with the Arabic script. Yes, it's together. It's not apart. It's not east and west. It's not here and there. This is the easy form, this is the form of the archives in our museums, in our heads, and this is for creating dominance. In fact, if you look, this is the way how we create dominance over culture. And if you want to be subversive, really, you have to look into the personal archive and the personal story, and then you find enormous contradictions. You find guilt. You find victimization. You find terrible stories, great stories, love stories, a lot of material.
So,
yeah,
Deniz, I'm not sure if you have a question. Your comments raise lots of questions about the significance of biography and familial archives, but I'm not sure if you wanted to raise a different question first before we move into that vein.
I was thinking that quote from Gefährliche Verwandtschaft really fits in perfectly here, and I should have asked Tom to read it himself, but I'm just going to read it for him from his translation, Perilous Kinship, so because it's also about the city of Berlin in that case, not Istanbul. So we discussed this actually in the seminar also. I regularly visited the city archives. My reading concentrated on the 30s. I read the newspapers of the period, trying to form a comprehensive picture of opinions and moods. History always has a used up side and an unused up side. On the used up side of the historians labor. They attempt to reconstruct. I wanted to work on the unused up side. I knotted together the threads in my mind to form the idea of a novel with my grandfather as its central figure. My task was to construct what could not be reconstructed. Grandfather might have been a character invented just for this purpose. Much in his life had remained concealed. His death was mysterious, ultimately unsolved. I had his diaries, which I could not read. What did I need the archives for? So this question at the end, sort of what are archives good for, is really interesting to me, because it suggests that it's really the imagination that's needed to tease out those hidden stories from the archives, even if we visit them, that is the task of the writer, as you just said. Yes.
Not to have one misunderstanding. I don't doubt that for a for a person who is working on history, as a scientist, archives are very important. Documents are very important. I'm talking from the position of the writer, because sometimes those things are very confused. The writer comes up and the other person who wants to talk to the writer talks to him like he's a sociologist. Or he's a historian. No, he's not his sociologist. He's not a historian. He does some kind of type of other work, and this is what it describes. What kind of work is this? Steht auf einer anderen Seite und schaut auf die Dinge von dieser anderen Seite. He looks from the other side. And this is sometimes difficult to defend, because we are in a very aggressive mood of positioning yourself. Everyone expects a kind of positioning, and if the real subversive position is that you don't position yourself. So this is possible in literature, in fact.
Yeah, but it's actually that what enables us probably to get to that entangled relationship between the documents and the papers from the past. Absolutely. And collective consciousness and that subjective realm of emotions and affect. So that was something that also, students were very interested in. This how does that texture work? And, you really kind of bring that into
I read the comments about the Perilous Kinship, and I found it very interesting how there were very, very good comments on the real topics of this book. I mean, exactly the black hole and this memorializing the memory, and maybe I see one word to this book, Gefährliche Verwandtschaft. It was very much. I was busy in the beginning of '90s with this. Like a comparatist, someone who wants to compare the history of Turkey, Germany, and all those terrible experiences of the memory of the 20th century genocide and terrible wars and everything. And I could see that there is a kind of very strange kinship between this Turkish and German experience, that on the one side there is this enormous monumentalization, Monumentalisierung von Erinnerung. You have big monument of Erinnerung in Germany, and on the other side you have the black hole. There's nothing, it's just you look in this darkness, and on the other hand, you have this enormous silence, the Schweigen in the families in Germany. You have the monument, but you have no personal history in it. So this is the main subject of this book, that how to talk about it, the Schweigen. And it seems somehow not very original, because the idea was also a problem in the 50s when everyone was, the writers who wanted to talk about it were somehow blocked. And when in the 60s is starting this so-called past, challenge the past started, but it never arrived this level of very private, the private story, history of victims and perpetrators, die Schuldigen und die Erfahrung der Schuld. So this was the main background.
I mean, another layer that gets lost often in the discussion of that book and other works is the irony, that there is a sort of, very ironic staging of these multiple, perspectives, and it doesn't present the history in kind of one linear fashion, but in fragments, and so. But we should probably, get back to your point of das Herunterbrechen von den großen Erzählungen über Identität, and to open our ears. So you're kind of, especially in the more recent work, you're increasing focus on the personal archives, the kind of, family archives. And so that was something that flowed into your book on your father, Mutmaßungen über den Glauben meines Vaters, in deinen Worten. It's also in Das Fremde, but we have, wait a minute. Yes, we have one more passage from Das Fremde to illustrate that, right? And to me that seems like a kind of project of resistance, also resistance to these grand narratives about identity that we are constantly confronted with. And so this passage now is not about the father, it's about the mother. Meine Mutter war eine fleißige Briefeschreiberin. So again, we will be projecting Kristin's wonderful translation as you read that. Okay.
Okay. I dedicated this book to my mother, who was a teacher, and born 1923. Somehow the first generation of Turkish women coming in this Republican sphere of education and breaking with the traditions of the old world, which gives not much brief to women, in fact, in general. Meine Mutter war eine fleißige Briefeschreiberin. Was aber steht in diesen Briefen, die sie an Freundinnen, an ihren Ehemann, an ihre Schwestern gerichtet hat? In vielen Fällen hat sie Durchschriften gemacht. Es sind eben nicht nur alltägliche, banale Berichte und Privatnotizen, sondern auch viele persönliche Beobachtungen einer Frau aus der ersten Generation der türkischen Modernisierung in Deutschland, der 60er und der 70er Jahre. Deutschland ist in diesen Briefen vor allem München, eine Stadt, deren Umbruch von einer heimeligen Provinz zur wichtigen Metropole in den frühen 70er Jahren von meiner Mutter genau beobachtet und festgehalten worden ist. Sie wirkt in ihren Briefen nicht wie eine Fremde in München. Sie lebte gerne in dieser Stadt. Von Heimweh ist nicht oft die Rede. Öfter findet man dagegen ironische Bemerkungen über Deutsche, die sie nach einem Termin für ihre Rückkehr fragen. Es kommt ihr manchmal so vor, als würden viele Deutsche kleine Ausländerbehörden sein, die Auskunft verlangen. Aber man spürt in diesen Briefen auch, dass sie an einer gewissen Einsamkeit litt. Ihre Bekannten sind weit weg. und neue Bekanntschaften bleiben oberflächlich. Dabei wirken manche der Deutschen, die in ihren Briefen vorkommen, oft wie Eindringlinge, die Ansprüche stellen. Sie wollen meine Mutter öfter sehen, sie stellen Fragen in Bezug auf ihr bisheriges Leben, sie nehmen an Familienleben teil, werden durch den Sohn nach Hause gebracht und ihre Geschichten, die sie ungern erzählen, werden von meiner Mutter eher erraten als wiedergegeben. Das Gespräch mit den Deutschen ist eine Einbahnstraße, notiert meine Mutter einmal. Die deutschen Freunde sind nicht sehr gesprächig, aber ihnen wird Respekt und eine gewisse Nachsicht entgegengebracht. Das Selbstbewusstsein der neuen deutschen Frau rückt dabei mit der Zeit immer mehr ins Zentrum der Betrachtungen. Zahlreiche Artikel aus Zeitungen und Illustrierten der frühen 70er Jahre, die sie ausgeschnitten hat, deuten darauf hin. Meine Mutter hat alles aufgehoben, was ihr interessant erschien. Das gilt eben auch für ihre Briefe, deren Durchschriften sorgfältig geordnet und gut erhalten sind. Doch die Frauen der Nachbarschaft, mit denen sie in Kontakt steht, scheinen keine Geschichte zu haben. Die meisten, noch im Krieg geboren, erzählen wenig von ihren Eltern, Vätern, Großvätern. Ihre Mütter sind meistens noch am Leben, aber praktisch stumm. Deshalb war meine Mutter auf Mutmaßungen angewiesen. Unsere deutschen Nachbarn sind Kinder von Vertriebenen, schreibt sie, aber sie versuchen, das zu verheimlichen. Denkt sie dabei an die Mutter meines besten Freundes? Zu ihr baute sie ein herzliches Verhältnis auf, eine Frau mit dunklen Locken, stechend blauen Augen und ebenmäßigen Gesichtszügen. Die beiden finden sich gegenseitig schön, anziehend. Es knistert, wenn sie aneinander treffen. Das bilde ich mir vermutlich ein. Schon früh habe ich eine Neigung, die erotischen Komponenten einer Beziehung zu erspüren und zu übertreiben. Auch gleichgeschlechtliche. Dieses Rätseln über das neue Land und den Lebenslauf seiner Menschen aus der Sicht einer Fremden wäre auch für die Deutschen selbst eine wichtige Perspektive für ihre Selbstwahrnehmung, denke ich. Ich werde den Gedanken lange für mich behalten. Interessieren tut sich dafür niemand. Das stelle ich mir immer wieder in Gesprächen fest. Es fehlt sogar die Vorstellung, dass es überhaupt solche Zeugnisse geben könnte.
Am I unmuted? So this is the second part of a larger essay, and you don't know particularly in this essay whether or not you actually read the letters of your mother, but I just wanted to note a passage that really struck me from the book about your father in Deinen, Worten, where you talk about how you have his archives and they're stored by you at your house, somewhere close to you, that you packed them with your own hands, but that you have not yet opened them. And that you're sort of sitting on that and you're waiting a little bit to open them because you're afraid a little bit that this archive of his documents and letters might hold some contradictions, and that might change your memories of him in some way. And I was just wondering if you might reflect on your relationship to the letters of your mother and whether or not you've actually read them and engaged with them, or if you see sort of rather this writing about the letters as itself a kind of imaginative process of engagement that is even more important for you as writer. This kind of creative process of engagement.
I even don't know if these letters exist in reality. They are part of the book. It's very important in this book. The whole figure of the mother is very important. But of course, there are some letters, but they are much more central for me at this moment when these letters were for my mother, I would say. And why? Because my memory of my mother searching for partners and engaging in a discussion or in a kind of exchange. This is the main point, you know, because the Turkish migration to Germany had a very special social surrounding and a special social sound. And in this sound, our family was absolutely outsider in Germany. not because we were Turks and we went to another country. We were not part of this migration, in fact.
Because of your parents' particular background and the reasons that you migrated?
Yes, yeah. yes. So everything, all those written papers from the history of my mother and all those archives which really exist from my father, with different scripts, different generation of people who are writing letters to each other. It is not part of the story of migration of Germany. It is not part. And alone this, that this is not the part, is the starting point for writing. Alone this is the absolutely sufficient starting point for write big novel, writing stories, writing poetry. And this is why I want to try to tell in this book. It's not interesting what's in the letters of my mother, or if I have 50 or 70 and where I kept them. The interesting thing is that it's not a subject. Nobody will interest themselves for kind of material like this. And this is not a kind of prejudice. It is about describing a kind of discourse which is concentrated on the dominance of the migration talk. I say always migration talk because it's a kind of discourse which has nothing to do with the heads of the people. You know, it's a kind of media discourse, talk shows and people making comments and so. And ich habe versucht, jahrelang eigentlich nicht Teil dieses Diskurses zu sein. Und ich habe dann gemerkt, ich bin Teil dieses Diskurses. Und das ist ja auch der Ursprung der Ironie, von dem Deniz gesprochen hat. In dem Moment, in dem man merkt, dass man ein Teil von etwas ist, das man im Grunde genommen verabscheut, richtig verabscheut, kann man nur zwei Reaktionen haben. Man wird ironisch oder man wird aggressiv. Ich bin ironisch geworden, glücklicherweise.
So it's almost as if we can speak of a double kind
Aber
of.
wir machen uns sehr viel vor, wenn wir über Migration reden. Ich bin immer sehr erstaunt, wie eloquent und wie einfallsreich wir über diese Prozesse reden. Aber wir reden ja gar nicht über diese Prozesse, weil wir einfach über die Menschen hinweg einfach was konstruieren. Ja, mit Identitäten, Türken in Deutschland. Ich werde oft nach Türken in Deutschland gefragt. Ja, wer sind denn die Türken in Deutschland? Ich weiß es nicht. I just don't know who are the Turks in Germany. I don't see any group which exists like this. I don't see it. Yeah. It's a number maybe, but it's not, it's a absolutely head-bird thing, you know, Türken in Deutschland. Something, it's necessary for Hans Sarrazin to write a book maybe, but not for the writer, you know.
It seems almost like if we come back to Deniz's comment on archival resistance, that texts like this one about your mother formulate a kind of double archival resistance in the way that they both point out the lack of an existing archive of migration and the fact that these kinds of documents exist, but Germany has failed to collect them. And also a resistance to the desire to create some kind of unilateral narrative that would come out of archives that document, right? And this gestures towards this use of irony and creativity in your writing. I think that could make a lovely move into the question of poetry, which sort of comes up with the excerpt from the novel. But I want to make sure that Deniz doesn't have a question before we move on.
Well, you know, I think it's good. It's a good time now to transition into the work in progress, isn't it, Zafer?
Yeah. I think so.
To share that.
Time is running out now.
And there's a history. There is a history to that also, because you know, back in was it 2008?
Yes, it was 2008.
when
late
Zafer
spring.
In Berkeley, he actually shared also work in progress with us. And at that time, an excerpt was translated by David Gramling and published in Transit. We'll show that in a minute. So, and this book got sidetracked or sidelined or was on the back burner, however you want to say. You're going to say something about it yourself, but it's now approaching completion. So Eurasia, Zafer, you want to comment on Eurasia?
Yeah. As you mentioned, a long time ago, 2008, means 13 years ago, I started to write this book, and I was reading, in fact, the first chapter during our meeting in Berkeley, and David Gremling kindly translated this chapter for Transit, for the magazine we were editing, and then I stopped somehow to write this book for years. I was busy with this collections I did, and also with the father book, which was very, very complicated to write, in fact, over 5 years. And then it was always in my head. So I was thinking, what's missing here in this story? Because the story, it's a kind of side story of my Turkish novel, Alman Terbiyesi, Deutsche Schule. This novel plays in the Second World War, where a former Ottoman German officer is sitting in Istanbul trying to organize a kind of anti-communist resistant, pro-Nazi resistant in Soviet Union during the war to help the Germans to win this war. And indeed, this happened, really. And hundred thousands of soldiers moved from the Red Army to the Wehrmacht. And it's a kind of other hidden story in this enormously broadly told and written history of the Second World War, that in the end of the Second World War, hundred thousands of soldiers among the German army were not Germans, and were also not Aryans. They were really foreign people from different, very, very different type of Asiatic population. And there is a lot of document, if you want to find, in the archives. Even writers like Ernst Jünger were writing about this issue. And involved was a certain Graf von Stauffenberg in this project, was the master of the project. And so when I discovered the story, I was always thinking, my God, this is an enormous big story, but I am not a historian. I will not go into the archives. I want to write something, but from which perspective? And when I developed to write this perspective from the son of one of the soldiers who came to an end of the war to Bavaria, marrying there a Bavarian woman, and the son, a teacher in his 60s, is writing or telling this story. And maybe we can read now a small passage in German, and then the translation of one chapter into English, no?
Yes.
So I start to read the small, short passage in German. It's now chapter 5. It was chapter 1, 13 years ago. It's moving forward. Der Teppich des Vaters. Ich berühre das Blut meines Vaters, das Blut, das er auf seinem Gebetsteppich vergossen hat. Ich habe ihn nie auf diesem Teppich knien sehen. An seiner Stirn gab es kein Gebetsmal, das sich im Laufe von Jahren bildet, wenn die Stirn sich regelmäßig am Teppich reibt. Nach seinem Tod habe ich den Teppich aus dem Eichenschrank geholt, in dem er unbenutzt lagerte, neben anderen unbenutzten Dingen, habe ihn am Boden vor meinem Schreibtisch ausgebreitet. Wie eine Zone, die man nicht betreten darf, ragte auf dem Holzboden hervor. Würde man diese Zone ungeachtet aller Vorahnung betreten, bliebe ein solcher Schritt gewiss nicht folgenlos. Manchmal sperre ich mich auf diesem Teppich ein, verliere mich in den lebendigen Mustern des Teppichs, beobachtet die Gazelle auf dem Sprung, die von der Leiste am Rand nach außen zu drängen scheint, den Brunnen in der Mitte, aus dem Tulpen hochschießen, Tulpen, die mit Blut begossen worden sind. Mit wessen Blut? Das Eigenblut der Betenden, die diesen Teppich unterm Arm trugen, über Flüsse und Steppen von einem Kontinent zum anderen? Oder das Fremdblut, das beim Vorübergehen vergossen werden musste, um zu überleben oder auch nur, um einen mehr oder weniger sinnvollen Auftrag zu erfüllen, in einem Krieg, der nicht der eigene und bereits verloren war. Wir waren Krieger auf Durchreise, pflegte mein Vater zu sagen. Wir hatten keinen Boden mehr unter den Füßen, keine Heimat, die es zu verteidigen galt, kein Land, das sich von uns erobern ließ. Wir waren immer auf dem Rückzug. Wir zogen uns in ein fremdes Land zurück, dessen Menschen uns fremd waren, dessen Sprache wir wie das Schießen erst lernen mussten. Wir wurden rekrutiert, um zu uns selbst zu finden. Doch wie findet man zu sich selbst, wenn man kein eigenes Land hat, keinen König, den man bewundert, keinen Glauben, kein Vaterland, wenn die Toten, die man zurücklässt, von niemandem begraben werden? Das ins Gewebe eingesickerte Blut hat den in hellen Farben gehaltenen Teppich dunkler werden lassen. Ich starre auf die Farben, bis sie anfangen zu verschwimmen. Ich verharre an meinem Schreibtisch. Es wird langsam dunkel.
Yeah, do you want to say a bit more about the novel, or do we move straight into the next passage?
I would say we read first the next passage, and then I will talk about the novel a little bit more.
Okay, so the next passage is the one that was collectively translated in my seminar, thanks to Google Docs, and another. So Zafer shared this with us. It's from this your Eurasia project, and it is titled "Die Rückseite der Dinge," which we translated as "The Other Side of Things," and the translation will actually be read by Freya. Freya, who is joining us from Shenzhen, China. She had to get up at very early, 3 a.m., I think, to participate in this event. Thank you, Freya. So I will project the German original, and Freya will read the English translation of this passage. Okay. Wait a minute, share screen.
Thank you for having me.
Hi.
Okay. Freya, the floor is yours.
The other side of things. I had inherited a case full of papers, a small black briefcase. One would expect it to contain official documents, certificates, bureaucratic language. But the case was full of poetry. The texts, handwritten on loose sheets of varied sizes in shades of discolored yellow, were addressed to me, my dear son, but they did not read like letters. Rather, they seemed to move away from the addressee into a language more concerned with itself. In such a language, the reader becomes entangled and can no longer leave the text. That is what happened to me. As I read, my thoughts let go of me. I hurried away from them and became perfectly thoughtless. The language separated itself from the void that my thoughts had left behind, building a new world for me, one that was not grandiose, but mysteriously intricate. It put me in like a magnet. Though elusive to thought, it was a world that invited my discovery of its uncharted side. This other side of things, forever in the dark, now stood before my eyes. To take part in it, I only had to flip the sheets before me, deciphering their illegible script, trusting in the transparency of the papers that would reveal the secrets of a foreign tongue. This is the father tongue. It possesses a powerful, mysterious, commanding quality without requiring urgency, for it belongs to a trusted voice on which we must lean to, a voice we depend on without worry, knowing the risk of self-abandonment and effacement. Was there any way to rebel against such an impulse? Such a possibility does not exist against a magnet, unless one gives up one's innermost ore, becoming ambiguous and impersonal. I was happy to own these pages. Indeed, I was also somewhat proud. These pages would see notes and entries from a faraway time reviewed not by a date, but by the yellowed paper. The sheets, completely covered in the script with which I learned to read, felt like my own skin. They now taught me a new mode of thinking. To accomplish this, I had to forego the thoughts that had once brought order and security into my life, for they could no longer fulfill this role. The father tongue enables you to remain silent. It locks you in and protects you from being accessed. From the outside, you can no longer be seen, but within, you discover the highs and lows. At birth, you beheld the light of the world, but now you carry this light from one world to the other. The lost land, holding the sacrifices of your father, such an unattainable distance becomes as small as a signet ring, a chip of the nail, as quick as a breath of air, as far as a North Star. The pain of your father becomes your inspiration. His homesickness is your longing for unexplored terrains. Hence, your fear to embark on a long journey, the false tracks you have laid out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you also for the translation. It's great. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Here we are back with the letters.
And the poetry.
Yeah.
Yeah. I told you I write only one book. I mean, I started to write this book in the beginning of 90s, and it's just like kind of large one book, which is coming from very different perspectives and sides.
So maybe you should switch to the poetry as a closer before it's too late. We only have little time left.
Oh yeah,
Sure,
really?
We could read the poem and then we could sort of have a closing discussion.
We can switch to the poetry.
So maybe I should just say that we were intrigued by the idea of the archive as inheritance, and also what it might mean to inherit poetry. And I was also interested in highlighting some of your work that was written in Turkish in the last 20 years. And I had been working with this collection, İlk Işık, or First Light, and was struck by the opening poem in particular. And we wanted to highlight it, both to come back to questions of sound and to the role that the Turkish language plays in your larger body of work.
Well, maybe I say one thing to the Turkish language, because of course I published Turkish work after 2000, but I was always writing also Turkish. It was just not visible because I didn't publish this text. So there is no transition from German to Turkish or something like this in my work. It was always there. It was just not published, and I started to publish Turkish with a volume of poems. And the title of this book was Kara Kutu, Black Box. And the title was Program. Because the language, my mother tongue, was the black box, and I started from this point, you know. So I read now this Turkish original of the poem. We have translated in a great way. So, and
we'll note that we decided to not show the text for these. We just want people to listen.
So I read Turkish now. Attention. Let's switch to the third language. Başına gelen ne geldi ne gelmedi. Onu ne duydun ne duymadın. Ne gördün ne görmedin. İçindeydi, senin sesindi o. Hem de dışarıda bir yabancının sesi. O hem bir sesti hem de değildi. Sana varmıştı ve senden ayrılmıştı. O hem varandı hem de ayrılan. Ne duyuldu ne de sustu. Ne içeride ne dışarıda. Oydu seni bekleyen hem de beklemeyen. Sense ne ona eşlik edendin ne de uzağında duran. Tutuş şimdi ama yanma. Hiç olduğun yerde kal.
So I will read an English translation. That which befell you neither occurred nor didn't occur. You neither heard it nor didn't hear it. You neither saw it nor didn't see it. It was inside of you. It was your voice, but it was also outside, the voice of a stranger. It was both a voice and it wasn't. It reached you and departed from you. It was the one arriving and departing. It was neither heard nor was it silent, neither within nor without. It was the one waiting and not waiting for you. As for you, you were not the one accompanying it, nor standing afar from it. Catch fire now, but don't burn. Remain where you are nothing. So there were many options to translate, to many different poems to choose from, and there were others that I also really liked in this collection, but I thought this one was really interesting because, number one, it's the opening poem, and it sets forth this series of impossibilities that sort of are carried out through the course of the collection. And maybe in closing, I would ask you two questions. One is about the way that particularly your Turkish language poetry feels loosely inspired by mysticism, and in particular that this contradictory view of the self, or this idea of viewing oneself from the outside. And I was wondering if there's a way that, for example, however long ago your translations of Yunus Emre sort of influenced your writing of this poetry in some way. And then my second question is that you note in Das Fremde, deinen, jedem, wohnt, there's a point where you talk about the difficulties that you particularly face in translating your own poetry from Turkish into German. And you basically say it's impossible. I can't translate my own poetry from Turkish into German. And it has to do with the sound of the Turkish for you and the difficulties of reproducing the sound. And this was something that was also particularly difficult for me when attempting to translate this poem. And I was wondering if maybe you could just reflect on either of those questions for us in closing.
Yeah, I start with the second. Translation is art, and not everyone can translate. And it's you can make a copy of a text, but it's not translation. I mean, the translation of a poem to get another poem. This is a kind of new writing the poem. And it makes no sense to rewrite your poem in other language, because you have written this poem in a certain time and you cannot copy the time. It's a time problem. It's not only a sound problem, it's a time problem. The time is over. And the time you write the poem is the time where the poem exists to start and to establish itself. And then afterwards, if you go to rewrite it in the other language as a writer, you write another text, for sure. Also, translators write sometimes other texts. It's normal, but for the writer, that's a big risk. I did it for fun, few times. I didn't publish this, but I just wanted to see, can I ignore the time, this time issue, the difference? It's very difficult. It makes no sense. And this Turkish language is very special, and I am very glad that I can write also in this language from time to time, because I know a lot of people who never read anything from me because they don't read German, they don't read English, they don't read Spain, they don't read Italian. So they read no language where some of my books were translated or are written in the other language. So they can read it in Turkish only. And these people can read it in Turkish, and this is perfect for me for the first time. The other thing is that Yunus Emre was, of course, important because it was the big first translation I did in the 80s. And it was very much connected to the heritage of my father. I mean, he was absolutely familiar with these things. He was knowing all those old Ottoman poetry and folk poetry by heart. And but it started for me to be very interesting when I discovered especially German Jewish writing from the 19th to the 20th century. For example, Rosenzweig and his translations of Yehuda Halevi, which is a poet from Andalusia, Jewish Arab Andalusia, before the Reconquista. And I suddenly discovered two poets who wrote nearly the same thing, more or less. You know, it's very, very strange. The poets writing really very similar lines and ideas, and so I understood that there is a kind of a more how you call it, more universalistic tone in this. And then I was very much connected with the poetry of post-war in German, Paul Celan, Ingeborg Bachmann, and all those recalling these poets with the sound of my childhood. All those signs, Unreadable archives started getting led me to start this books in Turkish language, more or less. And for example, there is a poet, his name is Asaf Halet. He's not very good known, Asaf Halet Çelebi. It's a great, great poet of the 30s, 40s in Turkish language, who was influenced enormously by India, by Far East, and by French poetry of the time. And he wrote cubistic poems with full of mysticism. And this was, for me, I searched for the book he wrote. He wrote only one poetry book, only one volume. It was called Om Mani Padme Hum. You can see the Asiatic influences on it. So this volume was sold out. It was published in the 40s, 50s. And when I was searching for years, this book in all bookshops in Istanbul. And also the way to this poet who brought together very, very different traditions in a very unique new language was very striking for me. So I have a lot of figures, noises, kind of clang issue in my head when I write poetry from very different backgrounds, in fact. And all those languages are not translations because they are in my inside. You know, I have them inside. And yeah, I can talk longer about this issue, but we have not so much time. So the poetry issue is very important for my writing, also for the other form.
Yes, I think we're maybe out of time, but it is a beautiful place to end on, to think about your poetry as a kind of intertextual and multilingual archive of relations between these really diverse poets who've been influential on your own writing.
Oh,
I'll hand over to Deniz for the last word.
Thank you, Kristin.
A concluding word, but you know, this is an ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
To be continued. It was wonderful to get this whole palette from your recent work, and we look forward to reading more poetic fiction.
Thank you to make this possible.
Yes, and thank you everyone in the audience for participating. We probably didn't get to all the comments and questions in the chat. So there is an opportunity to continue the conversation a little bit in a breakout room. So if anyone is very keen to participate there, let us know. So we'll, sort of convene a little bit. Otherwise, yes, thank you everyone for being here. And thanks in particular to Zafer and to Kristin.
Thank you for inviting me.